Hello, and welcome back. I'm Aiden, your narrator for tonight. I'm so glad you've returned. Come, settle in, and let's leave the world outside exactly where it is. Tonight, I'll tell you a story called The Tide Weaver's Daughter, a quiet tale set on a moonlit coast where the ocean glows with cold, living light, and a young woman named Maris wades into the shallows alone for the very first time. It is a story of inherited gifts and the courage of solitude, of learning that the deepest connections cannot be rushed, only received gently when the time is right. Before we begin, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it as you settle in? We'd also love to know what kinds of stories stir something in you. Your thoughts and suggestions mean more to us than you know, so please share them in the comments below. If you'd like to go deeper with us, our Patreon is open, where you'll find early access to stories before they reach anywhere else. And if Terence has become part of your nights, subscribing is the gentlest way to keep us close. It costs you nothing but a moment, and it helps us keep this space warm and quiet for dreamers like you. Now, let yourself arrive fully. Shift into whatever position feels most natural to your body. Let your shoulders release, your hands grow still, your breathing slow and even. In through the nose, out through the mouth, each exhale carrying a little more of the day away. Feel the weight of yourself surrendering, unhurried, into the surface beneath you. When you're ready, let's step together to the edge of the water, where a moonlit shore is waiting. The tide is beginning to rise, and Maris is about to discover just how deep her gift truly runs. The sea had its own way of breathing. Maris had known this since she was very small, since the days when her mother would carry her down to the shallows in the last pale light of evening, and set her bare feet in the cold and foaming edge of the water, and whisper to her about the gift. The gift did not announce itself. It did not arrive like a storm or a sudden gust of wind off the open water. It came the way the tide came, slowly, inevitably, without urgency or drama. A rising, a presence that was there before you fully noticed it, the way warmth is already in a room before you register that the cold has lifted. She was 27 now, and her mother was asleep in the cottage on the hill behind her. Tonight belonged to Maris alone. She had lain in her bed for a long time before rising. Not sleeping. She had known before she closed her eyes that sleep would not come easily on a night like this. But resting, lying still in the dark, and listening to the sounds of the cottage around her. The old wooden walls had their own voices. The beams shifted and settled through the night the way old things do, releasing the tension accumulated during the warmer hours of the day. The wind moved through the eaves in long, low frequencies that she felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. And beneath everything, steady and immense, the sound of the sea itself, the deep rhythmic pulse of it, present even through walls and distance, a frequency so constant that she had learned to hear it only when she actively listened, the way you hear your own heartbeat when the room goes silent. She had risen quietly, without lighting a lamp. She knew the shape of her room well enough to move through it in the dark, finding her clothing by feel, pulling it on with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing exactly this for years. Her feet found her shoes by the door. She lifted the latch slowly, pressing the door closed behind her with equal care, and stood for a moment on the threshold between inside and out. The night air reached her immediately. It was cool against her face and the backs of her hands, carrying salt and the particular cleanness that comes off the open ocean. A freshness that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with the hundreds of miles of uninterrupted water that stretched beyond this coast. She breathed it in with deliberate attention. Let it move through her. This was something her mother had taught her first, before any of the formal instruction. How to arrive. How to bring herself fully into the moment of the thing, rather than carrying the previous hour with her. She stood on the threshold, and she breathed, and she let the evening settle over her like something worn. The moon was generous tonight. It hung above the water, round and high and unhurried. The kind of moon that seems to have no intention of moving, that appears to have settled into a perfect position and decided to simply be there for a while. Its light came down evenly across the hill, and the path and the distant glimmer of the sea, casting everything in a pale silver that was not quite bright enough to be called illumination, but was more than enough to walk by. The shadows of the trees were long and soft. The stone wall at the edge of their land was a dark line against the moonlit grass. She walked the path from the cottage to the shore the way she had walked it 1,000 times. Past the low stone wall, whose flat top was cold and slightly damp under her fingers, where she trailed her hand as she passed. Through the stand of salt-twisted trees that grew along the upper edge of the beach, their trunks bent inland by years of prevailing wind, their branches reaching away from the sea as if in supplication, shapes that looked, in the moonlight, like figures frozen mid-gesture, caught in some ancient and perpetual argument with the weather. The trees were familiar to her, in the specific way that things are familiar when you have grown up among them. Not consciously noticed, but deeply known. Their particular silhouettes registered somewhere below the level of thought. Beyond the trees, the path widened and shifted from packed earth to sand, the soft, loose sand of the upper beach that shifted under each footfall and made a faint sound with every step, a gentle displacement, unhurried and whispered. The sound of it was pleasant, meditative, each step a small punctuation in the rhythm of the walk. The beach opened before her. She paused at the top of it, as she always did. This was a small ceremony she had developed without planning to, a moment of standing still at the threshold of the beach, before descending to the waterline, before beginning anything, just looking, just being present with the scene. The sand stretched in both directions under the moonlight, pale and undisturbed at this hour, the last traces of the day's footprints and disturbances smoothed by the afternoon tide into something clean and unmarked. The dunes rose to either side, covered with the coarse grasses that bound them together, their seed heads moving almost imperceptibly in the light air coming off the water. And the sea itself, it was calm tonight. The swells were long and low, moving in from the dark horizon with the patience of things that have been traveling for a very great distance and have no particular hurry to arrive. Each one rose as it approached the shallows, building itself unhurriedly into a low wave that broke with a soft sound, more a shush than a crash, more a release than an impact, and then retreated back into the body of the ocean with a long, gentle sigh. The sound layered over itself in the way that waves do, so that at any moment you could hear the echoes of several different waves in several different stages of their lives, approaching and breaking and drawing back, each one a slightly different pitch and volume, the whole of it combining into something that was closer to silence than to noise. The water's surface was alive with light. Maris had grown up thinking bioluminescence was ordinary, She had been perhaps 12 before she understood, from a school book and then from a conversation with a visiting scientist who had come to study the phenomenon, that it was not common, that most coastlines did not have it, or had it only rarely, only in certain conditions, only when the right organisms bloomed in the right temperatures, under the right circumstances, that the steady, generous glow of the water along this shore, the particular way the light moved through it in drifting clouds and loose spirals, always present, always blue-green, always beautiful, was specific to this place, this coast, this combination of conditions. She had tried to imagine what it would be like to see the ocean for the first time at night and find it dark. She could not quite do it. The darkness of the water seemed unnatural to her, a diminishment. This light, the cold, clean, living light that moved through the shallows and gathered in the hollows of the waves before their breaking, was simply part of what the sea was, as far as she was concerned, part of its nature. She walked down to the water's edge. The sand changed under her feet as she descended from the upper beach to the waterline, dry and loose and pale at first, shifting and sighing, then firmer, darker, slightly damp. The sand that had been wet earlier and was now being returned to by the incoming tide, then wet and dark and flat, the surface of it catching the moon in places, the surface of it crossed by the thin foam edges of retreating waves. She stopped when the water reached her toes. Cold, noticeably cold, the kind of cold that moves up the foot and into the ankle on contact, that reminds you clearly of the temperature differential between living warm body and living cold sea. She did not flinch from it. She let it be cold. This was also something her mother had taught her. Not to resist the physical conditions of the weaving, not to override sensation with intention, to let the sensation be part of the information, part of what connected you to the place. The cold water against her skin was not a distraction. It was data. It told her the temperature of the sea, and the temperature of the sea told her something about the depth of the currents currently moving beneath the shallows. And the currents told her something about the state of the tide and its direction and its strength. All of this happened below the level of conscious reasoning. Her body knew things her mind had not yet formed into words. She breathed in salt, the mineral undertone of open, deep water, seaweed and distance, that faint iodine sweetness that she associated with strand lines and low tide. And something else, something she had no name for, something that was not a smell exactly, but was registered by the same part of her as smell, the presence of the water as a living thing, vast and cold and old, and entirely indifferent to individual concern, while being, at the same time, completely responsive to the kind of attention she brought to it. A paradox she had spent years learning to accept rather than resolve. She looked down at her hands. In the moonlight and the blue-green light of the bioluminescence, the markings on her skin were visible as a faint tracery. They ran from the tips of her fingers up the insides of her wrists, branching slightly at the forearms, continuing up past her elbows and over her shoulders and across her collarbone and her shoulder blades. She could not see those, but she knew their shape from years of looking in mirrors and from the way her mother had traced them with one careful finger, once when she was small, describing them to her. During the day, in sunlight, they were nearly invisible. A slight iridescence, like the sheen on certain feathers, easy to mistake for a trick of light. But at night, near the water, they remembered what they were. They brightened slowly, the way embers brighten when you blow on them, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a gathering quality, a rekindling. The pulse began, not quite her heartbeat, not quite the rhythm of the waves. Something between the two, something that was both and neither, a negotiation between her body and the body of the sea. She had felt it so many times now that the sensation was as familiar as breathing, but it still moved her slightly, still produced, somewhere in her chest, a feeling she could only describe as recognition, as if two things that were supposed to be in contact had finally, again, touched. She raised her hands, not a demanding gesture, not an imposing one. Her mother had been very clear on this from the earliest lessons. The weaving was not command, it was not control. The ocean could not be controlled, not by anyone, not by any amount of gift or practice or will. To try to command the water was to misunderstand completely what the gift was for, what it was. The gesture was more like opening, presenting the palms to the water in a motion that offered rather than demanded. Here I am. Here are my hands. I am the one my mother told you would come. The water responded. It was subtle. It was always subtle at first. A slight change in the direction of the nearest wave. A drift that went left when the wind would have sent it right. A gathering of bioluminescent light near her feet, the particles moving toward her rather than away, accumulating at the line where water met sand in a soft and brightening concentration. The markings on her hands and forearms brightened in return, answering. The conversation beginning its familiar opening exchange. She felt the warmth that moved from her chest down her arms and into her palms. It was not an uncomfortable warmth. It was the warmth of a muscle finding its range of motion after long rest. The warmth of use, of purpose being met by capacity. Her mother had described this sensation as the feeling of a door opening, and Maris had always found that accurate. Not a door that required force, but one that swung easily on its hinges when you turned the handle, revealing the passage behind it. She began to move her hands. The motions were slow and considered, more like conducting something very quiet than like any kind of effort. Her left hand rose by a few inches, fingers spread, and the surface of the water ahead of her responded with a subtle swelling, a low ring of displaced water that moved outward from a point in front of her feet, perhaps 2 feet in diameter, unhurried. The bioluminescent light tracking the displacement and brightening along its edge. Her right hand turned, palm rotating through perhaps 30 degrees, and the ring of water bent in response, its path curving, becoming an arc, becoming the beginning of a spiral. She deepened the spiral. Both hands were moving now, in small, careful increments. Each movement considered before it was made and then released into the water and left to find its own completion. The bioluminescent light traced every motion with faithful responsiveness, building a record of the weaving in cold blue-green fire that drifted and shifted and slowly faded in the current before being renewed by the next gesture. She had always loved watching this, the way the light made visible what would otherwise be invisible, the way the weaving appeared on the surface of the water, like handwriting that dissolved as fast as it was written. Time began to behave differently. This was something she had given up trying to explain to people who did not weave. She had attempted it a few times, once with a friend from her years away from the coast, once with a researcher who had expressed interest in the experiential aspects of the gift. and each time the explanation had arrived at the same problem. There were no adequate words for a state that was not quite ordinary consciousness and not quite anything else she could name. Absorbed, her mother called it. Present, in the water. What it felt like from the inside was something like this. The boundaries of herself became permeable. The sense of being a discrete and separate object, located at a specific point in space. That sense, which was so constant and so assumed that it was usually invisible, like the air inside a room, softened, diffused. She was still aware of her body. Her feet were still cold. Her arms were still raised. But she was also aware, with the same immediate quality as bodily sensation, of the temperature gradient where the cold, deep water met the warmer shallows. She was aware of a large school of fish moving in the middle distance, their collective motion creating a pressure differential she could feel in her palms. She was aware of the slight acceleration of the incoming tide. It was coming in, she could feel it, an increase in the energy behind the swells, and of the way this change in the tide's direction was already reshaping the patterns of light she had created, the spiral bending under a new pressure. She adjusted. A small movement of the wrist, a slight increase in the height of the left hand. The spiral compensated, straightened, held its integrity against the new energy of the rising tide. She made the adjustment without thinking, the way you shift your weight when the ground beneath you shifts, the way balance corrects itself before the mind has finished understanding that correction was needed. This was the part her mother had told her could not be taught. You could show someone the opening motions. You could explain the theory of the gift, the relationship between the markings and the water, the principle of cooperation rather than command. You could stand beside them in the shallows and describe what you felt and why your hands were moving the way they were moving. But the part where theory became sensation, where instruction became knowledge, that part could not be transferred through words. It had to be lived, repeated, practiced in all conditions over enough time that the body learned what the mind never fully grasped. Maris had been practicing for 8 years. She was only now beginning to understand how much she did not yet know. The thought moved through her without disturbing the weaving. This was also something that had taken time, learning to think during the weaving, to let awareness of other things pass through her consciousness without pulling her out of the connection. In the early years, a stray thought had been enough to snap the thread entirely, to leave her standing in ordinary water feeling foolish and diminished. Now, thoughts could pass through her like fish through the water she was holding, present, noticed, and gone, without changing the essential current of what she was doing. She thought about her mother. She thought about the first time she had watched her mother weave, really watched. Not the half-aware watching of a child playing at the edge of the shallows while her mother worked deeper out, but the full, attentive watching of a teenager who had just been told, for the first time, the truth of what she was watching. She must have been 16. Her mother had taken her down to the beach at night and turned to face her on the sand and said, without preamble, "You know the light in the water. You have always known it. Tonight, I am going to show you why it knows you back." She had watched her mother wade into the shallows up to her knees and raise her hands. The memory was clear in a way that few memories were. She remembered the particular quality of the light that night. Overcast, no moon. The kind of darkness that made the bioluminescence in the water seem even brighter by contrast. She remembered standing with her own feet still on dry sand, too nervous to go closer. Maris remembered the way the water had moved, the way it had gathered around her mother's legs as if drawn there, as if recognizing something it was glad to find again. She remembered thinking that it looked like the water was listening. She had not known yet that she was watching herself, that what she was seeing was not merely her mother's gift, but her own, waiting for her, already there in her hands and her skin and her blood. The spiral she had been maintaining had widened to perhaps 15 feet across. The bioluminescent light within it pulsed with a gentle and regular rhythm, the waves moving through it, but the pattern itself persisting, sustained by the steady, small movements of her hands. She had not been aware of how much time had passed. The moon was noticeably lower in the sky. It had moved westward, imperceptibly, the way all such large movements happen, which is to say that she had not seen it move at all, but only found it in a different place when she thought to look. The tide had come in while she worked. The water was above her ankles now. She noticed this with interest rather than surprise. The tide rising around her while she wove was not unusual. It was, in a way, the point. To be working with the water as it moved through its own cycles, not waiting for perfect conditions, but finding the practice within whatever conditions existed. A low tide and a high tide were both water. A calm sea and a rough sea were both the same sea. Her mother had insisted on this from the beginning. The gift was not a fair weather thing. She thought about the year she had left the coast. She had been 22. A decision made with the logic of someone who had not yet fully understood what she was or what the leaving would cost her. She had wanted to know what other places felt like, what a life without the tide felt like. She had gone to a city inland, taken a small room, found work, made friends who did not know about the gift or the markings or the particular quality of her attention near open water. She had lasted 14 months, not because the city was wrong or the people unkind. The city had been exactly what cities are, dense and loud and full of a kind of energy that was exciting and then exhausting, and then simply the texture of daily life. The people had been as good as people anywhere. She had been happy in the way that it is possible to be happy when you are not yet quite aware of what is missing. But the missing had accumulated. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation, only a slow and growing awareness that something she had assumed was simply part of being alive, a particular quality of attentiveness, a specific way of being present in her own body, was fading. As if without the practice, without the nightly conversation with the water, the gift was not simply dormant, but was withdrawing, pulling back inward, like a tide retreating from a shore it was no longer sure of. She had packed her things and come home. She had not told her mother why. She had not needed to. Her mother had opened the cottage door and looked at her and said only, "I know," and put the kettle on, and that had been the entirety of the conversation required. The first night back at the water, she had stood at the edge of the shallows for a long time before raising her hands. Not because she was afraid, because she wanted to feel the moment of return, the specific quality of a thing coming back to itself after being absent. She had raised her hands slowly, and the water had responded immediately, more immediately than she had expected, as if it had been waiting, as if her absence had been noticed, as if the sea, that vast and patient and entirely impersonal thing, had held a particular place empty in its awareness and was simply glad to have the shape filled again. She had wept, standing there in the dark water. She was not sure why. Her mother, the next morning, had called it a recognition. The memory released her gently. She returned to the current moment, to the spiral she was maintaining, to the cold water around her ankles, to the bioluminescent light that tracked her hands, without any sense of jarring transition. Memories moved through the weaving differently than they moved through ordinary thinking. They came and went cleanly, without the grasping quality they sometimes had in the waking mind. She did not cling to the memory of the city and the leaving and the return. She let it pass and let it be what it was, which was simply a part of the longer story of how she had come to be standing exactly here. The spiral held. She deepened her breathing without changing the rhythm of her hands. There was a technique her mother had shown her for this, for working deeper while maintaining the surface of the weaving, for going further into the connection without losing the patterns she had already established. It required a particular quality of divided attention, one part of her mind remaining at the surface and one part following the current downward, and it was something she had only begun to manage in the last 2 years. She followed the current. Below the shallows, below the sand and the first layers of sediment, the sea had a different temperature, colder, more constant, removed from the daily fluctuations of sun and wind. The currents here were slower and more certain, following paths they had been following for longer than human civilization had existed, carrying water from the cold deep to the warmer shallows and back again, in loops that made the surface patterns seem small and brief by comparison. She was aware of all of it, for a moment, the way you are aware of a vast room when someone lights a single candle in its center, not seeing everything, but knowing that everything was there. The cold deep and the warm shallows, the ancient paths of the currents, the living things in the water around her, from the bioluminescent organisms producing light at her feet to the larger presences she could sense in the darker water beyond. The weight of the moon on the surface above her, and the long, slow response of the water to that weight, the tide itself, the tide she was here to work with. She held this awareness for as long as she could. Then, gently, she rose back to the surface. Her hands had not stilled while she was in the deeper awareness. They had continued their slow movements, maintaining the spiral by a habit that had become deep enough to function without conscious attention. This was the most advanced thing she could do, and still, she knew only the beginning of what was possible. Her mother had told her once about a weaver from an earlier generation of their line who had been able to maintain 3 separate patterns simultaneously while holding the deep awareness and having a conversation. She could not imagine this. She was not sure she believed it. And yet the gift had surprised her before. The spiral she had been holding was wide now, perhaps 20 feet across, its inner rings turning slowly, its outer edges diffusing into the general motion of the sea. The bioluminescent light within it had shifted color slightly, warmer, more yellow-green than the cold blue-green of its beginning, which meant the water temperature in that column had changed, had been warmed by the work of her hands and the energy she had been bringing to it. She noticed this with quiet satisfaction. Small things. The work was made of small things, carefully attended to. She let the spiral dissolve, not with any dramatic gesture, simply by allowing the movements of her hands to slow and then cease. By withdrawing the intention gradually, rather than abruptly, the way you end a conversation by letting it slow rather than cutting it off. The bioluminescent pattern faded with quiet grace, its outermost edges going first, then the inner rings, then the center, the whole of it releasing back into the general luminescence of the water, the individual light rejoining the collective, the specific dissolving back into the general. She lowered her hands. She stood in the rising water and breathed. In the aftermath of weaving, there was always a particular kind of quiet. Not the absence of sound, the sea was still present and articulate around her, but a quiet in herself, a settling. The boundaries that had been permeable became defined again. She was here, in her body, in the cold water, with her feet on the sand. She felt the specific tiredness that came from weaving, not the tiredness of the muscles. Her arms were not sore, her back was not stiff, but something deeper and harder to locate. A mild exhaustion in whatever part of her the gift actually lived, as if an organ she was not otherwise aware of had been at work for the last however long, and had arrived at a natural stopping point. It was a good tiredness, the best kind, the kind that came from using what you were for. She turned slowly and walked back toward the shore. The sand felt different underfoot, now that the water had risen, firmer, colder, the surface of it rearranged by the tide's work, footprints that had been clear on her way out now, soft-edged and half-filled. She walked without hurry. The salt-twisted trees were ahead of her, dark shapes against a sky that was beginning, very faintly at the eastern edge, to suggest that somewhere beyond the visible, beyond the curve of the earth, the machinery of morning was making its long preliminary movements. Not dawn, not close to dawn, but the beginning of the ending of the night's deepest dark. She passed through the trees and up the path, feeling the sand under her feet give way to packed earth and then to the grass of the hill. The stone wall was cool under her hand. The cottage was close now, its silhouette familiar and solid against the sky. A single window caught a faint gleam, moonlight reflected from glass. She stopped outside the door and looked back toward the sea. From here she could not see the water itself, only the sky above where it was, which was slightly lighter than the sky over the land. The bioluminescence she had just been standing in, contributing almost nothing to the visible world at this distance, only its memory in her hands and the slight warmth still present in the markings on her skin. She thought, "I will come back tomorrow night." And she would. She always did. The practice was not a thing you interrupted. It was a thing you returned to, the way the tide returned to the shore, not because the tide was compelled to, or because it had no choice, but because this was simply what tides did. Movement and return, going out and coming back. The rhythm without which there is no rhythm at all, only stillness. She opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The cottage received her with warmth and the smell of old wood and the dried herbs that hung from the ceiling beams, and the particular silence of a place where someone is sleeping deeply in another room. She moved through it in the dark, knowing the shape of every space, every object. She poured water and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the narrow slice of sea, visible between the hill and the tree line, just catching the moon. Then she set down the glass. She moved through the cottage toward her room, her feet quiet on the familiar floors. Outside, the sea continued. The swells rose and fell. The bioluminescent light drifted in the shallows where she had been standing, bright and cold and patient, following no instructions now but its own ancient nature. The tide continued its slow progress up the beach, doing what tides do, knowing what tides know. And the night held everything gently, the sea and the shore, the cottage on the hill, the sleeping mother, the daughter returning to her bed having done what she was made to do, held all of it in the same generous dark, without distinction or preference, as it had held every night before and would hold every night to come. The sea breathed, and Maris, in her room, at last allowed herself to sleep.